Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening, taking the time to listen to these conversations, and also for supporting the Thomas Jefferson Hour. There are a great many of you who do that in large ways and small ways. We appreciate it all. And if you'd like to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can click on donate, and there's a number of ways to do it. Having said that, you can also go to jeffersonhour.com to learn all about Clay's retreats and particularly his cultural tours. And that is the subject of this week's conversation. Clay, a few weeks ago, you sort of turned the tables, interviewed me, and I said, turnabout's fair play. I want to talk to you about these cultural tours. And thankfully, you agreed. And it was just a delightful conversation. I enjoyed it so much.
Well, it's a way of warming up for the France trip that I will be on by the time this airs, taking about 25 people through France. We also do trips, as you know, on the Lewis and Clark Trail, mostly in Montana and Idaho.
Yeah, we talked about that quite a bit at the beginning of the program. You know, once you get on Lewis and Clark, it's hard to quit.
It's so interesting. And Steinbeck in Monterey, California, and Jefferson's Virginia, and Cuba, which is not really Jefferson. It's more Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander von Humboldt, and Hemingway, plus the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and on and on. We're going to Greece in 2023. I hope people will really join us for that. That was my first love. I remember reading Homer in the original Greek at Oxford, struggling. My daughter learned it at Columbia, and when we were last there at the Mycenae, where Agamemnon lived, she recited the first 12 lines of the Iliad in Greek. Much to my astonishment.
I'm not surprised, however. Let's get to the conversation and the show this week. But before we do, one thing that you brought up, and you don't need to go into detail because it's in the conversation and in the show this week, but the bit about what you're doing with Whitehouse.
Joseph Whitehouse.
That whole segment of the conversation and his diaries from the Lewis and Clark. I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, just this much about that.
You told me you'd give me a copy. I'm going to hold you to that.
Oh, absolutely. Very, very, very high resolution scans of the original field journal of Joseph Whitehouse. And then I'll be transcribing it and providing editorial annotations.
Let them hear the full-length conversation. But with that, thanks so much for the conversation this week. And again, if you want to learn more about Clay's cultural tours and his book retreats especially, go to jeffersonhour.com and you can find it there.
But David, one more time,
yes?
How can people go to, what website can people go to look at your Francis Densmore work?
Oh, thanks. lakotasongs.com. All one word, lakotasongs.com.
And man, will you be impressed if you do, my dear citizens.
Oh, thank you.
Send your help to the Jefferson Hour if you can. I'm always begging for ranches and farms and oil wells. Now I want an electric bike. Come on, folks. This is your way to support the hard work that we do here at the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David, thanks for everything.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm David Swenson, and I'm joined today by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, it was a few weeks ago that you kind of turned the tables and interviewed me, and I so appreciated and enjoyed that. This week, I'm going to do the same to you, sir, if I might.
Well, I so congratulate you on your extraordinary project involving the late Francis Densmore, who came to the Great Plains around 1910 to record native sound, and you've done some pioneering work to bring that back to life, and not just for scholars, but for the Lakota, including Lakota children. So congratulations for that.
Yeah, primarily for the Lakota, and thank you again. But this week I want to talk about you. I want to ask you some questions involving, people who listen to the show oftentimes hear you refer to cultural tours, etc. And just to give us listeners some backstory, tell me how that all started and what you do on these cultural tours, who attends, and what you accomplish and the things you see.
It goes back, David, to, I suppose, around 2003 when the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition was coming. And I was at an event in Lewiston, Idaho, and met a woman at a dinner where we just happened to be seated next to each other. And we both asked each other what we wanted to do during the bicentennial. And we both said it would be great to take people out onto the Lewis and Clark Trail to show them where Lewis and Clark slept and where they canoed and where they had difficulties and so on. So this began, and that's the source of all of the rest of it. Eventually, then, we did Thomas Jefferson's Virginia. I've done that, I think, 3 or 4 times. And we've done Jefferson's France. This will be the 3rd time on that. And then it branched out away from Lewis and Clark and Jefferson to Theodore Roosevelt and John Steinbeck and so on. And so the cultural tours, it's just an idea that I didn't know it would work. And now, thanks to really great management and the website that our own friend Nora handles, we have waiting lists for all of the cultural tours. And so that's a deep delight. And then we finally, a few years ago, added the winter encampments at Lochsaw Lodge because it's January, no one's out there. It's a perfect time to go and talk about books. So this has become a significant part of my life and career. As with almost everything in my life, David, it was sort of an accident.
Yeah. Well, when we first met in Bismarck and you asked if I would fill in for a couple of shows on the Jefferson Hour, here I am all these years later.
17 years ago.
Yeah. You weren't doing much of this at all. I mean, primarily you were on the road lecturing and performing as Thomas Jefferson, but this is really sort of morphed into a major part of what you do.
It has, and I love it, by the way. And when I'm out on the Lewis and Clark Trail, I always say and mean that this is the best travel week of my year, climbing Wendover and canoeing in the White Cliffs section.
I know, if I might interrupt, I know that you love this, but I have to say that the people that attend these love it, and I know that because I read the emails, and you've sort of developed a subculture of those who would brave that Wendover March and go out on the river, and it's not just Lewis and Clark now.
No, you're quite correct. So speaking of subculture, some have come on the trip many times, and a few years ago they had a reunion in, I don't know, Arizona or Santa Fe or someplace, to which I was not invited. It was like the 20 people that I brought together, sort of like, well, we're not bringing him. So
they probably figured you would never be able to come because you are so busy.
Everyone asks
I'm giving
about
you a polite out on that.
Yeah, well, I'll explain it as you will, but it's great because this community now exists, and they have Zoom calls. I've also been doing these online courses, and I've created another little community, and they meet from time to time, like once every 2 weeks on Zoom, and I'm not part of that, and I'm thrilled for this because, I mean, the whole point of my life has been to build a humanities community, and to some limited extent, I have been able to do it. So
that's good. You know, I'm glad you went there because that's kind of where I wanted to go. I mean, I know you and I would stand with the statement that learning is one of the purest pleasures there is, and you should never stray from it. It keeps us alive, alert, and young. And really, aside from all the adventure nature of the Lewis and Clark trips, and this idyllic floating down the river in canoes, and the great care that people are taking, it is a learning experience, and you're at the center of all of that.
Well, the Lewis and Clark story is endlessly interesting. In fact, I never get tired of it, and I've spent the last 30 years, I suppose, trying to understand what happened, especially what happened to Captain Meriwether Lewis, who appears to have committed suicide just 3 years after they returned. But it's not the kind of thing where you can kind of understand it and then you put that in a manila folder and bring it out every July. It keeps changing. So I gave this year some lectures I've never given before. I've undertaken some new Lewis and Clark editorial projects now. I was just made a list the other day for our mutual friend Russ Eagle, who's one of the most stalwart joiners of the Lewis and Clark trip, and now part of the staff. But I made a list of what I think are my contributions to Lewis and Clark studies. And I was pretty surprised at, if you spend 40 or 30 years at this, you start to develop a real, I won't say mastery because that would be too strong a term, but a very deep immersion into this world. And so I can tell everyone this, shamelessly, I'm the world's leading expert on Lewis and Clark in North Dakota. Of course, I'm the only one, but still, I'm happy to be that person. But let me just say this of the cultural tours. They're so magical, and I don't know what the magic is, but it's like the people who self-select to come, the places that we go. There's a fair amount of instruction, but it's by no means academic or heavy. There's a lot of humor, as you know. There's a lot of adventure and joy, and people sweat, and they want to whine, but they don't because we have a no whining rule. But they exult because they climb hills that Lewis and Clark climb, and they canoe exactly. I mean, without any shadow of any doubt, precisely where Lewis and Clark canoed in the Great White Cliff section of the Missouri. So there's a sense in which people identify with that adventure, that epic, I'd call it, in early American history, what James Rhonda called America's first great road trip. But they also, they test themselves. Relationships are deepened. Some relationships are born. People's lives are changed by this trip. And I would love to say it's me, and I'm sure I'm in there somewhere, but it's mostly a combination of different factors. And so it's the best thing I get to do.
I know from what you told me that it's changed your life. But there was a lot that you just said. If I can unpack just a little bit of it, to me, there are, as you said, the first great road trip. This is the great adventure story of that era of America, and people are fascinated by it and read about it. But there's something different. Not when you're not just reading about it, but you're there. I've never been on one of your tours. I have been on the trail and tried to trace places and find places. There's something different when you're there, and you being the leader of all of this. And as you said, you've given a couple of new lectures that you didn't really even anticipate. What kind of things do you get to share with people? What kind of things do your attendees learn because they're there?
Well, they first of all understand the challenge of the expedition. So as you know, they're carrying about 30 tons worth of stuff from St. Louis, and in 3 boats, a big barge and 2 pirogues, and they shed one of the barges, but they've got this flotilla. And eventually they get through the Great Falls in today's Montana, and they get to the base of the Rocky Mountains. And Jefferson had sort of told them, yeah, they'll be about 4,000 feet high, and there'll be a Cumberland Gap, and they'll look a lot like the Appalachians. And Jefferson was no ninny. This was a standard view at the time. And they reach the base of the Bitterroot Mountains, the Rockies, and they're twice as high as they had been told, and extremely thick and formidable. Fallen trees everywhere. Winter comes really soon in September, and it stays until almost July. And so they hit the Rocky Mountains, and they have no longer 30 tons of stuff, but maybe 15 tons. And there's no way all that's going across those mountains, even with the 41 horses that they were able to purchase from natives. And so one thing you learn when you're up there is what that meant, because even climbing, we climb Wendover, which is 7.5 miles more or less straight up. It's not a Forest Service trail with switchbacks. And by the end of the day, you just wish you were anywhere but on that trail until you reach the top. And then you're like, hey, where's the whiskey? Where's the celebration? Where's the parade? I did what Lewis and Clark did. I'm a hero. Everyone feels that. I mean, you should see that night around camp. But my point is that everyone thinks, I went up there with a camelback filled with electrolyte and water. All the gear was taken up by trucks. I didn't have to bring horses through the snow. I wasn't wearing moccasins. Lewis and Clark crossed the continent with inadequate footwear. So you get up there and you think, this was the hardest, someone told me this year, this was the hardest physical thing that he had ever done. And this was a person who's been a lot of places and hiked. And then when you get to the top, you realize, and that was nothing. That's like That's luxury, Lewis and Clark. That's one thing. And then quickly, the other thing is when we're on the Missouri, on the first night we camp at Eagle Camp, where they camped, we know exactly where they camped. And the next day we go in our canoes, and about 45 minutes in, I say, turn your canoes around. And all like 12 canoes turn around. And I say, go against the current for 2 minutes. And at the end of those 2 minutes, people are cursing and saying, no, they couldn't have done it. It's impossible.
That's a great exercise. That's really good.
You need to come. Good. Everyone asks about you. I tell them that you are a very private person, but everyone wants you to come.
I'm a busy person, just like you. Listen,
well,
we need to take a short break, and I don't want to spend the entire program talking about Lewis and Clark, but there are some other things I want to ask you about, particularly the journals and the diaries, if that would be all right.
Certainly, sir.
Okay, well, we'll take just a short break, and we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, I get to talk to Clay Jenkinson about some of his career, some things that I wanted to ask him about. When we took our break, Clay, we were talking about your Lewis and Clark annual cultural tour, and it just sounds like so much fun. But I did want to ask you a bit about the diaries. I mean, how we know what we know. Of course, the main source is the journals, and that's a long story about how they never really were completed to Jefferson's requirements. But there were also some personal diaries that were left, correct?
There are letters, a lot of them, and they were edited by a man named Donald Jackson, one of the greatest of all Lewis and Clark scholars. And so there's a 2-volume set of those. They're absolutely essential. And then there's the 13-volume journals of Lewis and Clark by the University of Nebraska Press, and that was edited by Gary Moulton, who is the senior Lewis and Clark scholar in the country now. And then there are a few other things, but there are missing journals, and that's one of the really remarkable mysteries of this thing. So a man named Robert Fraser, who was a private, kept a journal, and he was planning to publish it. He issued what's called a prospectus in the papers that it was soon to be forthcoming. It never did. I think we can blame Meriwether Lewis for that. And several other diaries either never existed or have disappeared. So we don't have a complete record, but altogether it's 13 stout volumes plus 2 big volumes of letters. So we know more about this expedition than about any expedition in American history up until the Apollo Gemini system, where, of course, we had other ways of recording data. So it's a rich thing, and you can spend your life doing it. In fact, I'm starting a huge new project on Joseph Whitehouse, the private. He's the only private whose journal exists. It's in the Newberry Library in Chicago. I'm going to be editing it, and it's extraordinary, David, because it looks like it's been run over by a fleet of trucks and dumped in the river and bled all over and
probably
thrown in the air.
And
so and so it looks like a real journal, and it's been neglected. And you know this, like in the 13 volumes of Lewis and Clark come first for the first, I suppose, 8 volumes. And then the lesser diarists, Ordway, Floyd, Gass, come later. And in volume 11, it's Whitehouse. So let's say, just take a day, on January 1st, 1804, they were in North Dakota. They went to a dance at the Mandan World. If you study the journals, you go to volume 4 for that, and you read what happened as Lewis and Clark saw it on that day. But that doesn't give you what Ordway saw. That doesn't tell you what Gass saw. That doesn't tell you what Whitehouse saw. You have to go to other volumes for that. And that's a disincentive for people to read everything that happened on the same day. So Whitehouse has been ignored. And it turns out he's a very, very interesting diarist, in part because he was a private and not one of the officers.
Well, a couple of things. I'm interested to know what the future of that diary and the editing is going to be when it'll become available. The other thing is that you said earlier that sort of in a joking way, but it's true, that you are the leading Lewis and Clark expert on their time in North Dakota. You actually spent a great deal of time editing their journals, and that was published, wasn't it? for their time in North
The
Dakota.
State Historical Society of North Dakota commissioned me to edit the journals in the state. And by the way, in that edition, which starts on October 13th, 1804, and ends on August 20th, 1806, in other words, all the days that they ever spent in North Dakota, both coming and going, I print every diarist's view on the day that he wrote it. So you get Lewis, Clark, Ordway, Gass, Whitehouse.
Oh, I remember seeing some of that, but I didn't realize that was a rule.
So that was kind of a revolution, although it's now also the form on the University of Nebraska website where it's free. You can read all of Lewis and Clark at the national website, which is at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. But that's one thing. The second thing is I printed the weather on every day because they kept these weather charts. So every day that you see the weather, and it's really interesting because, as you know, as a North Dakotan, David, weather matters.
Not a great advertisement for visiting our state in the winter.
No, but if Clark says 2 men went out hunting this morning, came back soon thereafter, got nothing. That means one thing. When you look at the weather and, it was 29 degrees below zero and the wind was whipping at 40 miles per hour, now suddenly you realize why they came back as quickly as they did. And so that was one of the things in that issue, and it's also heavily, heavily annotated. I think I wrote 600 or 700 footnotes for it, and I'm immensely proud of that. I also did, at the same time, a little chapbook, which I think you've seen, day by day. And it's a tiny little thing like a passport book, but it has every single day that they were here a highlight. So today,
that was sort of a predecessor to what you did later,
right?
But
this is how I get ready.
The only journal that I am really familiar with is Patrick Gass. But this Whitehouse journal that you're working on now, is there a future for that, or are you just beginning?
There'll be a couple of years, maybe a year at least. So it's in Newberry Library in Chicago. I've made an arrangement with them, and here's what's so great about it. It's an authentic field journal. It's not, the Lewis and Clark journals are in the American Philosophical Society, and they look pristine because they're copies made by Lewis and Clark after the fact. But this journal is weathered like a field journal should be. We can post a photograph of it on the website. What we're doing, and this is so great, this is like a just-in-time technology, and this is such a gift that they're giving me. They have re-scanned every page at several thousand DPI. And you know what that means.
Yeah.
It means you could blow this up to the size of a building and you would still see great detail. And then we're going to print it. So the right-hand page will be an exact size facsimile of that page in the most extraordinary resolution and detail. And on the left side, I'll produce a transcript. I'll retranscribe it and have footnotes and introductory.
I love books that are laid out like that, and I can't think of one that would be laid out as extensively as what you just explained. But I love that.
But imagine if you had this, and of course I'll put one in your hands when it comes. But
thank you.
Imagine if you have this, and it's going to be a very high quality color printing. So it may look a little bit like a coffee table book because of the size of the thing, but when you open it, and let's say it's Whitehouse from July 4th, 1804. So they're at Independence near Kansas City, just where Fort Leavenworth will eventually be built. And Reuben Field was bitten by a snake and his foot swelled up, and they named this creek Independence Creek because it was the 4th of July and so on. So Whitehouse says all of these things, but when you look at that, when this is printed, David, you'll see the details in this. And it's way, way different to look at someone's handwriting than it is to look at the transcription, which will also be there.
Yes.
But let's say you're the kind of person who would said, I wonder if I could see more. And you got out a magnifying glass. Today, that would give you nothing because it would pixelate. But this will give you more and more detail because of the incredible scanning resolution of these pages. So, and then there will be introductory essays, including one on the journal as an artifact. And Whitehouse is himself a very interesting guy. He met Lewis and Clark at Kaskaskia on the Illinois side. He was a tailor. He was their skin dresser. He was nearly killed in southwestern Montana when a canoe rolled over him, and he would have been killed if it had been even 6 inches shallower in that creek. He comes back, he's discharged. He then went back into the army in 1812. He deserted in 1817, and late in his life, he gave or sold his journal, which had never been published, although it was prepared for publication, to a Catholic priest. And it eventually wound up in Wisconsin in the hands of none other than the great Reuben Gold Thwaites, the first great editor of Lewis and Clark. And for the first time in 1905, it was published by the University of Wisconsin Press. So that's Whitehouse. And here's the thing. David Nicandri, a frequent guest on this program and a dear friend of mine, who's an advisor to this project, he believes that Whitehouse is often the most interesting diarist because he mentions things that nobody else sees or bothers to mention. And so...
can you give me an example of that?
Lewis and Clark will say, 6 men went out hunting, one of them cut his hand. Whitehouse will say, it was Potts, and he severely cut his hand, and we bandaged it and did this and that. In other words, and often he has kind of like a private's view of things, and he has one really weird quirk. I've started in on this now. He wants to name every place they're at. Lewis and Clark don't name the places very often that they're at, where they camp, but he'll call it Cold Spring Camp or Rhubarb Camp or Wild Rose Camp. And why he did this, I don't know, because I don't know if he expected these names to hold, but almost every night when they camp someplace, he gives that camp a name. And I had never seen this. I've been at Lewis and Clark for 40 years. I had never seen this. This is why it's so important, David, as you know from your work on Francis Densmore and other projects. Until you look at something, you've never looked at something. And then when you look at something, all sorts of things pop that you never, ever could have anticipated. And you need to use a lens. The lens you wear determines the thing you see. The lens you wear determines the thing you see. Just as when you have a new vocabulary word, you tend to see it all over the place after that. But until then, it was right there, but you didn't see it. And so now that I'm looking at Whitehouse exclusively, I'm asking myself, does he ever mention the name Sacagawea? Does he ever mention the dog's name Seaman? Does he ever complain about anybody or anything? Does he ever talk about his own mishaps if he had them? In other words, I'm looking at it in isolation. And one of the things I'm trying to do is ask myself, if everything else had disappeared and we only had Whitehouse's journal, what would we know about Lewis and Clark? And it's a fascinating mental project.
Yeah, you have me. I'm really excited to see some of this. And good work, sir, and keep at it.
Well, I can't wait. They sent me the files. They're coming in a flash drive this week by mail, but I wrote to the director of the library and said, it's Labor Day weekend. I really can't wait. Can you send me the file? So they said, oh yeah, okay. So they sent me the file. It's too big. My computer won't accept it. It downloaded, but my zip says, no, we're not doing it. No, it's too big. And so I'll have to wait for the flash drive. I'll make you one.
Okay, so I'm going to try to take control back of this conversation, if I might.
Certainly.
It's hard once you get on Lewis and Clark not to just keep on.
Well, you too. We've been at this.
Yeah.
This is how we met.
Yeah.
I came into your studio to record Dayton Duncan because he was in town.
Right.
And I didn't really know you from Adam. I'd heard great things, but this was 20 years ago.
But back to your cultural tours, which is kind of where we started. It's not just Lewis and Clark in North Dakota and Montana. You do cultural tours literally all over the world.
Well, a bit of the world. So yes, I'm going to Greece next fall. So if you want to go to Greece, it's Homeric Greece. That's next fall, the fall of 2023. It's not posted yet, but boy, I hope we can get a wonderful group of people together for that. And then I've done twice before Jefferson's France. This will be the third time, and it's coming up in late September of this year. It's full, and we'll be spending 10 days in Thomas Jefferson's France, partly in Paris and quite a bit in the south of France, where he encountered the classical world.
But there's Cuba.
We've been to Cuba.
There's Greece.
Greece is next year. We've been to Cuba. We go to Monterey, to John Steinbeck's Monterey. Yes, I mean, it never ends. I want to do Robert Oppenheimer's New Mexico and Colorado. It's just such fun, but they take a while to organize. And as you know...
And research for you, too.
Well, that's the fun part of it. There's a distinguished literature on Jefferson in France, including a new book. We had him on, in fact. And there's there's a lot, of course, on Oppenheimer. And there will be a film coming soon, but on Oppenheimer, you could spend the rest of your life studying the birth of the atomic bomb and the tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Lewis and Clark, as you know, is endless. There's Theodore Roosevelt. But Greece, my first love was classics and literature, and I've kind of strayed. I tripped into history instead. But I've gone back to literature now.
Tripped into history.
I did. It was Ev Elbers, our mutual friend, who thrust me off the righteous path into history. But this last week, not to digress, and I know you want me to talk about France, but
I do.
I reread Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the greatest medieval poem of all until Chaucer. And now I've been reading biographies of Elizabeth I, and I'm working on maybe a novel based upon Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And so I'm kind of I'm an old man now. I'm kind of reawakening to my first love, which was literature and the high humanities.
Well, I did want to talk about France because actually when this program, we're recording it early in September, but when this airs, you will be in France.
Yes. And there'll be 25 people or so.
And the title of this tour is Jefferson's France, right?
Jefferson's France, right.
Yeah.
So he spent those 5 years there from 1784 to 1789. He got to see the beginnings of the French Revolution. There are a lot of monuments to Jefferson in Paris. There's a statue across from the Hotel de Somme, which became the model for the domed version at Monticello. There's a park that's named for him, and we know where he lived, although the building has been torn down. We know several places that he lived, and there's the Palais Royal, which was the world's first sort of, it's like the Mall of America. It's half theme park, half mall, and so on. So we know a lot, and restaurants that he went to and so on. So we'll spend a few days in Paris, and we've, worked with a company, the tour company, because they handle logistics. And then we'll go down to the south of France to Nimes, where he saw the model for the capital at Richmond, the Maison Carrée, which he said was the most perfect morsel of antiquity. And we'll go to Orange and all in Nimes and to Montpellier and to Aix-en-Provence and Marseille. So all of these places that Jefferson. And then we're going to, this was my indulgence. As you know, he spent a couple of days in northern Italy, in Milan, but then he turned back because he had such a sense of his diplomatic responsibility. But he called it a peep into Elysium. And when he went over the Alps into northern Italy, he actually tried to figure out where Hannibal had brought his elephants back in the ancient Roman world. And so we're taking the bus up to the pass where you look down into Italy, and that'll be our peep into Elysium. So these are just such fun, David. And of course, the accommodations are great. The food is world class. The wines are great. We'll also spend one day on the Canal du Midi, where he spent a week on it, and it was one of the happiest weeks of his life. And so this is like, it's not really even about Jefferson, as the Lewis and Clark trips aren't really even about Lewis and Clark. It's a great cultural tour that happens to be centered on our friend, Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah, and just how important Jefferson is in France is a long subject for discussion. I'm going to do something I never do, and that's quote a letter from a listener. But I do that a lot, but I don't have the person's name in front of me. But I remember the letter distinctly, and he talks about being in France on the 4th of July and all of these wonderful fireworks, and he talks to a French citizen and thanks them for noting the 4th of July, America's Independence Day. And the Frenchman looks back at him and says, "Don't you recognize that it's our celebration as well?" I just thought
That's
that was
great.
really, I'm really apologetic to the person that sent that letter, and I should have their name, but it was a great letter.
Well, David, that's so important because that's how Jefferson saw it too. That as you can anticipate the words that are about to come out of my mouth. The little flame that we lit on the 4th of July, 1776, will engulf all of the despotisms and tyrannies of the world. And so when the revolution hopped from Philadelphia to Paris, Jefferson was elated, and he had such high hopes for the French Revolution. It didn't work out, and he was a little bit embarrassed by that later in life. But he thought that we had started it, that the pivotal date in world history was going to be the 4th of July, 1776, and that France was the first but they were all going to wind up being constitutionally based republics with due process and the rule of law and rights traditions. And of course, that's mostly happened, but not entirely. And of course, here we're in some sort of a retrograde motion, aren't we?
Yeah. We need to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about Jefferson and many other things. Welcome back, Clay.
Glad to be here, my friend.
And I must tell you that during the break, it gave me an opportunity to look up that email, and I found it, sir. And it comes from Paul Grossgold, who's written to us many times. And this occurrence that I talked about happened in Cannes in the mid-'90s. He was actually on a naval deployment on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. And they spent the 4th of July in port. And he says, quote, "The city treated us to a fireworks display on the beach one evening. And I asked one of our French friends why the city was doing the show. I asked if it was an early Bastille Day celebration. And then he writes, she gave me a strange look and said, 'This is for the 4th of July. It's as much our holiday as it is yours.'" And I just wanted to share Paul's name in that letter because I thought it was great.
You know, there's so much disillusionment with the United States around the world. It's great to see affirmation of this sort.
Yeah, he writes, "It just never occurred to me that French participation in our revolution 2 centuries hence would still hold that much meaning for them. Such is the power of our experiment." So thanks for that, Paul.
They were both, the French Revolution went sour, but it changed France permanently for the good. France is now a republic. That revolution was pivotal there, although it was a bloodbath for a time. Our revolution was more benign, although not without its moments. But these were 2 great events of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the greatest thing that ever happened to human beings, and the Enlightenment had 2 magnificent societal expressions, one in France and one in the United States, and it gave birth to the Constitution of the United States, which, for all of its wear and tear, is still the great Constitution of the world.
So back to your tours. Now, you've done this tour of France about Jefferson's time in France before. And as you said, there are a lot of memorials, probably pretty much unknown to most Americans, to Thomas Jefferson, particularly in Paris. What kind of things do you make sure that those that accompany you see, and what kind of things are you able to share with them?
Well, we go to the statue and go to the Tuileries, which is the garden. It's like Central Park that overlooks the Seine, the great river that flows through Paris, and across is this building, which is now the headquarters of the French Legion of Honor, but it's called the Hôtel de Somme. And when Jefferson was there, it was being built. And he says in a famous letter that to a woman friend of his, that he would sit in a chair that he rented there in the Tuileries, and he said he would stare at the building of this domed neoclassical facade, quote, like a lover at his mistress, and that people around him thought he might be insane, or he's going to commit suicide.
But he meant it, right?
Oh yeah, he came back, and with money he didn't have, he plucked down Monticello, part of it, and rebuilt it with a dome, which wasn't finally completed until around 1808. When he was serving as president of the United States and had some cash. But, this changed his life. And you think of Monticello on the nickel, on the $2 bill. It's one of the most famous icons and one of the most famous buildings in America. And if you took the dome off of it, it would be a great building, but it wouldn't be Monticello. And so we go to places like that. And then we go to several restaurants that Jefferson frequented. And my favorite is
That actually still exist these centuries later?
Yeah, several of them still exist. Of course, under new management, let's say. But one was the Café Mécanique. It's in the Palais Royal. It's actually now, I think, Paul McCartney's daughter has a shop there. But when Jefferson was there at this kind of Mall of America kind of thing, although outdoor, he went to this cafe. And here's what's so great about it, David. The food was made downstairs in the cellar, and then it was sent up on dumbwaiters, on little food elevators, And Jefferson just thought this was the greatest idea ever. And so when he got back to Monticello, he had dumbwaiters built for wine in the dining room, and he had these carts that he also saw in France where the food would be put in and closed, and then it would be rolled in like on a rolling table to the chairs. And he just like a child, he just fell in love with this. So we go there and look. I mean, there's nothing left of it, but we go to such places. And so Paris is, and then of course we give people plenty of free time just to go do Paris. They go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower and drink champagne. Or I went last time to Napoleon's tomb, which is really spectacular. They go to the Louvre or to several of the other great museums to look at art. And so we want them, obviously it's Jefferson, but for many of these people, it's their first time in France. And with the help of me and our tour company, and also Beth Kaler, whom you know, who comes along and loves France, we get people to the places they want to get to see something of Paris. But then all good things must end. We get on this luxury coach. And when I say coach, it is to a luxury coach in America what our coaches are to like a school bus. And we get on and we then work our way to the south of France, and we see the classical antiquities of the south of France that so inspired Jefferson. And we go to Nimes and stay in a hotel and eat well. All the food, of course, is great. And then we go over to the Maison Carrée, and it's been beautifully restored. It was built in the 1st century of our era, and if you can Google it, anyone who's interested. But it's a rectangular temple, and Jefferson fell in love with it. Architecture was his favorite delight, he said, and he spent a lot of time studying it. And then when Virginia decided to have a new capital building in Richmond, he was asked by Virginia, knowing that he was the most aesthetically accomplished of all Virginians, to make a recommendation. He said, "Oh, there's only one thing you can do here. You've got to have a model of the Maison Carrée." And so he had a plaster model made, which you can still see in Richmond, and they built it, even though it wasn't a very convenient state capital. It's had to be added onto in all sorts of ways. But this is the power of Jefferson's aesthetic mastery, that George Washington deferred to him, John Adams deferred to him, John Randolph of Roanoke deferred to him. Everyone realized that, among other things, whatever else Jefferson is, he's the nation's leading aesthete. He's the nation's leading expert on painting, on sculpture, on music, on dance, on architecture. And so everyone realized there's one and only one Thomas Jefferson. So we go to those places, and again, we give people free time, so they go to cafes. I remember when we were in Narbonne, which is a beautiful city on the old Roman road to Spain, and we got to see a piece of the Roman road last time we were there. And then we had free time. I went into this market, this covered market, and you can't even believe it, David. There would be like 40 varieties of fresh fish, from octopus to you name it, to shark. And then there would be rabbits, and there'd be turkeys, and there'd be pheasants and doves and pigeons, all for sale to eat, and 300 different types of cheese, and 40 different types of apple cider. And this market was just like, it was the largest market of fresh, dead food that I had ever seen in my life, vegetables and animals and fish.
So again, we're back to Jefferson and his love of French food and culture, but I know, because I've learned this from you, his time in France had a real dramatic effect on his socio-economic view, his political view of the world. And there's a couple of stories that you have shared of occurrences where he would meet with French peasants, and a lot of that made it back to America.
So he saw something that maybe nobody else would have seen, which is that France is like looking in a dark mirror, a cracked mirror. When he saw what had gone wrong in France, the 1% had everything, the 99% had nothing.
Oh, tell that story about him meeting the French peasant woman. That's so good.
Well, this is where he begins to talk about distribution of wealth. And he's walking around Fontainebleau. He's striding around. He loved to walk. He walked more in France than at any other time in his life. And he catches up with this peasant woman, and she's walking somewhere, and he gets into stride with her, and And his French isn't great, but it's good enough, and they start to talk, and she tells him about her life and about how hard she has to work for just a penny, and how she doesn't always have food on the table, and how many hours per week the average peasant works. And he writes about this in a letter to Madison, and then at the end he gave her, I think, 8 sous, so like what we would, like a penny. It'd be like my giving you a penny. And she burst into tears of gratitude. And so then Jefferson gets to his study, and he writes a letter to Madison and says, "We can't let this happen in the United States. There is no just reason that this woman should be desperately poor. Poor is okay, but everyone," I'm paraphrasing now, using our terms, "but everyone has a right to a living wage if they are willing to work." He said, "We must figure out how to prevent this from happening, or we must have mechanisms to redistribute property somehow so that we don't let it all wind up in the hands of the few at the expense of the many." He said, people by being born have a right to subsistence plus. And if they're starving, as they're starving in France, that is not okay. That has to be stopped. And if that means we have to go in and take money from the richest people and redistribute it downward, we will do it, because you have a natural right to a subsistence plus, but you only have a social privilege to vast accumulations of property. And I hope this never happens, says Jefferson. I hope we never get to that point. As long as we have the West, maybe we'll never get to that point. But if we ever do, where the 1% control everything, or less than 1%, and the masses are suffering, then we must have mechanisms to right that. And if you don't, guess what? You're going to get the French Revolution. You're going to get the storming of the Bastille. You're going to get the Reign of Terror. So if you don't proactively work on these questions, they will bite you. And so Jefferson, I love this side of Jefferson. This is also when he wrote The Earth Belongs to the Living letter and so on.
Let me be the other side of that. It would have been good if he could have translated that into enslaved people as well. But
of course,
and we can't, and as always, we can't ignore that. But it does show a real good humanitarian side of him, and the fact that he did bring that back to America, almost a bit of a socialist.
It is, and when I mention this from time to time in a lecture or even in a performance, there will be people who push back and say, "That didn't happen. That could not have happened. That's communism. That's socialism. Jefferson didn't say that." And I say, well, here's the letter. You decide. Remember, he says, "I hope this never has to happen. I hope we never get into this situation." But he did say it because he believes, David, that let's take North Dakota. There are 760,000 North Dakotans. Jefferson believes that anyone who's willing to work should be able to have the basic fruits of life.
Yeah, it's okay to be poor, but not desperate.
Yes, because that's a social construct. That's not natural. That's a social construct when you have a tiny number of extremely rich people.
It's that Enlightenment thought. We're only as strong as the weakest of us.
But Gouverneur Morse was there at about the same time, the high-toned Pennsylvania Federalist, and he was like flirting with ladies and eating the greatest meals in the world and complaining bitterly about the French masses and complaining about French diplomacy. So he was a privileged American in Paris who didn't really give a darn about the suffering of the mass of French people. And Jefferson was a privileged man in Paris, and he felt it. And maybe there's a slight condescension, walked with a peasant woman, gave her 8 sous. But even so, Jefferson meant it, and he wrote a letter to Lafayette and said, "You got to get out here. You got to get out into the countryside to see how actual people live and suffer." He said, "You can never be a great leader until you go out amongst the people, maybe incognito, because otherwise they treat you too well. And you need to look into their kitchens, and you need to say you're tired and need to rest so you can get in their beds maybe and find out if they're comfortable. But you need to go look at the lives of the least people in your culture and ask hard questions about why that could be." Now, Jefferson understood that some people are bums, some people are lazy. We all know this. Some people are mentally handicapped. He's not suggesting some sort of a kind of a rigid socialist approach, but he's saying there's something wrong with abject poverty in a nation of plenty.
Do you touch on any of this kind of stuff on
I
your
lecture.
tour?
So we get to places, and if they have a lecture room or a meeting room, we have a beautiful bottle of wine. Of course, almost all wine is great in France. and some hors d'oeuvres, and then I will raise a question. I'll hand out a letter, or I'll quote something of Jefferson, or I'll start a conversation about this. So there's instruction, but as at the Lewis and Clark trip, the instruction is casual, not very formal, because it's not really about that. I mean, I want everyone to come away with a strong understanding of Jefferson and France.
What a great way to see France. How many people go? Is there a limit? Do you put a cap on how many can go?
We cap it about 25 because we don't want it to be that thing, where you've got a busload of people getting out and they're wandering around and they're on whisper sets and there's an umbrella. And we want it to be more intimate, and I wish it could just be like 15, but it would just be too expensive for people. But we cap it at 25 so that and also I should say, when I'm in Europe, and particularly in France, the last and the very last thing I want to appear is a bunch of Americans in their sweats, moving around with their big voices and their big body language and kind of overwhelming a cafe or overwhelming a museum. I always tell people when we have our orientation, we're having one this week, by the way, by Zoom, and I say, we are guests in France. It's their country. It's their language. It's their system. We are guests, and we must always behave with the grace and the humility of guests. It doesn't always work, but it usually works. And, the people who self-select
I bet you keep a pretty good
people.
handle on that.
Yeah, because I was just talking to my daughter Catherine about this. Even when I lived in England, and now when she lives in England, we lower our voices. We talk in a more restrained way. We hold our bodies in a little bit different way. And the last thing we ever want to be is, that guy. That the brash, big-bodied, egotistical
you can't help
American.
it. When you go abroad, you're representing your own country.
But you should represent it at its best and not at its worst. And you should always be gracious and remember that even in Britain, you are a guest. If they don't have ice for your drink, you don't throw a fit in the pub. You realize that's their system. And when they come to the U.S., they have to put up with our system. And there are lots of things about our system that they don't particularly like.
But before we're done, I know that these are ongoing. The easiest way for people to find out about it is to go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. But it would be tough for you to pick what your favorite one is, I guess. But I'm guessing Lewis and Clark and France are both near that top of the list.
It's apples and oranges, my friend, because Lewis and Clark is what I love most, as I know you do too. America with a capital A, the American West. There's something about, that's why we live here and not in Minneapolis or not in Chicago or not in Tampa, Florida. And so I love that. And when I'm out there, like this year, I had to climb the Wendover Death March twice. And each time at about the 2/3 mark, I think, no one but an imbecile would do this more than once. Absolutely. And of course, I have this advantage because we get the lens through which to do it. Anyway, thank you. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Cote Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.